There are moments in life when everything feels hollow. You wake up in the morning, surrounded by the familiar walls of your room, the same city skyline, the same quiet hum of the world outside, and yet, something inside you feels like it's missing. It's not sadness, not exactly. It's not fear. It's something deeper, an emptiness you can't quite name. And no matter how many distractions you pile on top, the endless scroll of news, the dopamine hits from likes and comments, the weekend plans, the new gadgets, the temporary victories, none of it sticks. None of it fills that quiet ache. Some people spend their entire lives trying to drown it out. Some pretend it isn't there. But every so often, in a rare, unguarded moment, it surfaces. And when it does, it asks a silent, merciless question. What are you holding on to? When the ground shakes beneath your feet, when loved ones are lost, when plans fall apart, when the identity you carefully built starts to crumble, what is it that anchors you? For centuries, human beings have sought refuge in something greater than themselves. Not because we're weak, not because we're incapable, but because life, by its very nature, is uncertain. And in that uncertainty, we long for a sense of meaning, a compass to navigate the storm. Some people find it in family, some in success, others in fame, in ideologies, in fleeting pleasures. But history has shown again and again that these anchors often fail us. They're beautiful, yes, but temporary, like sandcastles against the rising tide. This is where faith enters, but not the kind of faith the world often imagines. Not blind obedience, not desperate hope clung to in ignorance. In the ancient language of the Buddha's time, it was called Saddha, a kind of luminous, clear-eyed confidence in something greater than your temporary circumstances, forged not through superstition, but through personal experience and wisdom. It's the kind of faith that doesn't ask you to stop questioning. It invites you to. It's the faith of the traveler who steps onto a path shrouded in mist, trusting not because someone promised them a destination, but because countless others have walked it before and found their way through. It's the faith of the lotus rising from muddy waters, reaching for light it cannot yet see. Why do we need faith? Because without it, we are leaves in the wind, tossed by every mood swing, every headline, every heartbreak, every small betrayal of daily life. Without it, we chase shadows. We confuse comfort with peace. We mistake temporary control for freedom. Faith is not a luxury. It's not an ornament for the pious. It is the most intimate, practical tool for those who wish to live fully amidst a world that was never meant to be tamed. And yet, it's one of the most misunderstood qualities in modern times. Many imagine faith as something passive, a blind acceptance, an escape from reason. But in Buddhism, it's something entirely different. It begins as a spark, a quiet, intuitive recognition that perhaps, just perhaps, there's more to this life than chasing pleasures and avoiding pain. That perhaps the restlessness we feel isn't a flaw in ourselves, but a clue, a thread we're meant to follow. And when you tug at that thread, you'll discover that faith is less about clinging to answers and more about having the courage to live inside the questions. There's an old story about a man lost in the forest at night. He stumbles upon a narrow path, barely visible beneath the moonlight. In the distance, he sees the faint flicker of a lantern. He can't see the end of the road. He doesn't know where it leads, but something in him says go. Not because someone commands him, not because he's certain it will be easy, but because to stay where he is in the cold and the dark is a kind of death. Faith, in its most beautiful form, is this, not certainty, but the willingness to take the next step, to trust that beyond the limits of what you can see, there's a truth worth seeking, a peace worth discovering, a self you have not yet met. It's not a faith in dogmas, not a faith in magical beings, but a faith in the possibility of awakening here, now in this human body, in this very life. And though you may not yet know the path, though the fog may be thick and the night long, you begin. Because something within you remembers what peace feels like, even if you've forgotten the way. This is where the journey truly begins. And if there's one place to begin seeking that quiet, unshakable faith, It lies not in promises of heaven or in ancient rituals alone, but in something far closer, far more personal. In the next quiet moment, we'll explore what this faith truly means in the Buddhist tradition, not as belief, but as direct, transformative experience. So what is this thing we call faith? Not the kind sold in headlines. Not the blind belief that demands you close your eyes and follow. Not the superstition that clings to charms, rituals, or whispered promises of otherworldly rewards. In the language of the Buddha, it was called Saddha, and like so many ancient words, its meaning is easy to capture in a single English phrase. Some translate it as faith, others as confidence. Some call it trust. But none of these alone capture its quiet, luminous depth. At its heart, Saddha is a state of clarity, a recognition deep within that peace is possible, that awakening is real, and that the path to it has been walked by others and can be walked by you. Not because someone tells you so, not because a book insists, but because somewhere inside you can feel it. It's that moment when you hear a truth, not new, not foreign, but as if it were something you always knew and simply forgot. And it lands in your heart like a key turning in a long rusted lock. The Buddha never asked his followers to believe blindly. In fact, time and again, he warned against it. Do not go upon what has been acquired by repeated hearing, he said, nor upon tradition, nor rumor, nor the authority of sacred texts. When you know for yourselves that certain things are wholesome, blameless, and conducive to well-being, then accept them and abide by them. Faith, then, isn't a command. It's an invitation, an open door to step through, not because someone pushes you, but because you choose to, and that choice is sacred. In Buddhism, Saddha is the beginning of the path, the spark before the fire. It's what moves you to take the first step, to sit quietly with yourself, to examine your fears, your attachments, your unspoken grief, to listen not to the noise of the world but to the steady pulse of your own awareness. And here's the truth most people miss. Faith in Buddhism is never faith in something external. It's not about surrendering your will to a higher power. It's about remembering your own potential for awakening. Saddha is faith in your capacity to be free, even when you're lost in confusion, even when you've made mistakes, even when the night feels endless and hope feels like a distant memory. It's the seed of confidence that no matter how tangled your life has become, the possibility of peace remains. The great Buddhist teachers of old described Saddha as a light in the darkness, not a blinding light, not a sun at noon, but a single, steady flame, enough to take one step, and then another. And as you walk, that light grows, not because you're filling yourself with something new, but because you're clearing away the dust that has always hidden it. This is the true faith of Buddhism, not a contract you sign with the heavens, but a living, breathing confidence that wisdom, compassion, and liberation are already within you, waiting to be uncovered. There's a Zen saying, "Faith is the bird that feels the light and sings while the dawn is still dark." It doesn't wait for certainty. It doesn't demand proof. It trusts the promise carried in the air itself. And in the same way, Saddha invites you to trust the quiet pulse within you that whispers, even in your hardest moments, there is more to you than this suffering. You are not your fear, not your failures, not your past. You are the open sky behind the clouds, the stillness beneath the storm, the awareness watching it all rise and fall. And faith, true faith, is not about clinging to beliefs. It's about learning to trust that awareness. So when people ask, what does it mean to have faith in Buddhism? It means beginning. It means choosing, however uncertainly, however imperfectly, to take one honest step toward yourself. It means leaning into your own questions, sitting with your own discomfort, and trusting that peace isn't found by escaping your life, but by meeting it fully. That the path isn't out there in some distant paradise. It's beneath your very feet. And the more you walk it, the clearer the way becomes. In the next stretch of our journey, we'll trace this faith through the lives of those who have walked before us, ordinary people, skeptics, wanderers, seekers, each one beginning, as you are now, with a simple, fragile question. Is peace possible for me? And through their stories, perhaps you'll begin to sense that this path, this faith, isn't a relic of ancient texts. It's alive, waiting for you. Every journey needs a compass, a way to navigate through the fog, because no matter how brave, how sincere, or how determined we may be, we all lose our way. In Buddhism, that compass is called the three jewels, not because they glitter in the light, but because their value is beyond measure. They are the anchors for a mind adrift, the steady stones on which unshakable faith is built. The three jewels, or triratna, are simple in name, yet infinite in depth. The Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha. On the surface, they seem like titles, a teacher, his teachings, and a community. But these are not dry labels, they are living forces. Three refuges for a heart seeking peace in a restless world. And faith, true Saddha, is born not from ideas but from placing your trust gently, steadily in these three. First, the Buddha, not as a distant, untouchable deity, but as a reminder of human possibility. He was once like us, a restless mind, a seeker, a person burdened by sorrow, by questions, by the weight of life's inevitable losses. And yet, he woke up. The Buddha represents what can be realized when a person turns inward, when they refuse to run from suffering and instead lean into it, uncovering the simple, luminous truth beneath the storm. To take refuge in the Buddha is to trust that awakening isn't reserved for the chosen few. It is the natural birthright of every sentient being, including you. Next, the Dhamma, not as a doctrine carved in stone, but as the law of nature itself, the reality of cause and effect, of impermanence, of the way things truly are, whether we notice or not. The Dhamma isn't something you have to believe in. It's something you can see for yourself in every sunrise, in every falling leaf, in the aching of your own heart. It's in the way suffering arises when you cling, and peace blooms when you let go. To take refuge in the Dhamma is to trust that there's a way through this tangled life, that suffering is not endless, and that every moment carries the seed of freedom if you're willing to see clearly. And then the Sangha, not merely a group of monks in orange robes, though they too belong to it, but the community of those who walk this path, the friends of the way, those who stumble, rise, fall again, and continue. Ordinary people bound by a shared yearning for truth, for peace, for awakening. To take refuge in the Sangha is to remember you are not alone, that even when the world feels cold and indifferent, there are others walking beside you in silence. It is the faith that wisdom grows faster in good company, that hearts soften in the warmth of companionship. And when you take these three jewels as your foundation, when you begin to lean gently into their refuge, something shifts. Your faith stops being brittle. It stops needing to be perfect. It no longer clings to outcomes or demands certainty. It becomes like the earth beneath your feet, steady, unmoving, always there, whether you notice or not. In the ancient texts, it is said that those who take refuge in the three jewels are like travelers who find shelter in a storm. The wind may howl, the night may stretch endlessly, but inside there is warmth, there is light. There is the unspoken promise, this too will pass. And here's the secret most overlooked: the three jewels are not outside you. The Buddha you take refuge in is not only the historical figure who lived 2,600 years ago. It is the awakened nature within you, the part of your being that is already free, already wise, already luminous. The Dhamma is not just ancient scriptures. It is the living truth unfolding in every breath you take, in every tear you shed, in every dawn that breaks after your darkest nights. And the Sangha is not a distant assembly of saints. It is every person who has chosen, however imperfectly, to walk the path of mindfulness, compassion, and liberation. And that includes you. When faith is rooted in these three jewels, it no longer wavers with the changing winds. It becomes steady, clear, alive. It no longer depends on whether life is easy or hard, whether your meditation is deep or restless, whether your mind feels calm or chaotic. It holds like the earth beneath a storm. And slowly, without force, it transforms how you meet the world, You stop chasing. You stop running. You begin to trust the ground under your own feet, and from that trust, peace begins. In the chapters ahead, we'll watch how this faith deepens, how it faces doubt, how it holds steady through loss, and how it becomes not a shield against life's pain, but a lamp to carry through its darkest corners. Because faith in Buddhism isn't about clinging to the light. It's about learning to walk through the dark with your eyes open, and that is where the real beauty begins. There's a truth few people talk about when it comes to faith. It doesn't arrive fully formed. It isn't a lightning strike. It's more like a garden. You don't wake up one morning with unwavering confidence in life's mysteries or perfect trust in the unseen. No, faith must be tended, watered daily, nourished by practice, protected from the weeds of doubt. And in Buddhism, there's no expectation that you believe without question. Faith is not demanded. It is gently invited to grow. So how does one cultivate this quiet, resilient faith? Not through grand gestures, but through simple, consistent daily practices that whisper to the heart, you are not alone. You are held by something vast, ancient, and good. And among these, one of the most powerful tools is Anussati. Anussati means recollection or mindful contemplation. It is the practice of remembering, of consciously turning the mind toward what is worthy of trust, of reverence, of awe. In the earliest Buddhist texts, the Buddha spoke of several forms of Anussati meditations that steady the heart and nourish faith, especially in uncertain times. Let's meet them. First, the recollection of the Buddha. Each day you bring to mind the qualities of the awakened one, not as a figure frozen in history, but as a living reminder of what is possible within you. You remember his compassion, his wisdom, his fearless heart. And in doing so, a quiet confidence stirs. If one human being could awaken to truth, so can I next, the recollection of the Dhamma. You reflect on the teachings not as dogma, but as the reliable laws of cause and effect. The truth that all things arise and pass away. That suffering has a cause, and so does peace. That no experience, however dark, is permanent. In remembering this, you begin to trust the unfolding of your own life. To see your pain not as a punishment, but as a teacher, a necessary part of the great turning toward awakening. Then comes the recollection of the Sangha. You recall those who have walked this path before you. The monks, the nuns, the householders, the teachers, the unnamed seekers who rose and fell and rose again. Their example becomes a lantern, proof that the path is walkable, that you are not alone, no matter how lost you feel. Beyond these three, there are other Anussati practices, recollecting your own virtues, the generosity you've shown, the moments you chose kindness over cruelty, the strength it took to forgive or to begin again when you didn't want to. You remember these not to inflate the ego, but to nourish the heart, to remind yourself that goodness is possible here, now, in this very life. There's also the recollection of the devas, not in the sense of gods to be worshipped, but as beings of radiant mind, born of wholesome qualities. You remember that higher states of consciousness are real, attainable, and that joy, wisdom, and serenity are within reach. And there is the recollection of death, a practice often misunderstood as morbid, yet profoundly liberating. Each day you quietly remember, I too will die, not as a threat, but as a way to pierce through the trivial worries of the day, to see what truly matters, to soften the heart toward yourself and others. In remembering death, you no longer cling so tightly to what cannot last. And in that letting go, faith is born. A faith not in immortality, but in the preciousness of each fleeting moment. These recollections aren't ceremonies. They're simple, daily acts of turning the mind toward the light. You might do them in the quiet of morning, as you walk beneath trees, while washing dishes, or before you sleep. And slowly, like drops of water wearing down stone, these tiny practices reshape your heart. They remind you that no matter how chaotic the world seems, there are truths that do not change. Compassion matters, kindness heals, clinging brings suffering, and letting go brings peace. And in this way, faith takes root, not as blind belief, not as superstition, but as a quiet, luminous trust in life's deep currents. A knowing that beneath the surface of your doubts, fears, and longings, something steady remains. An old monk once said, "Faith is not what you feel when things go well. It's what you hold to when everything falls apart." And how do you learn to hold to it? By practicing, by remembering, by tending to your heart like a tender, growing flame. The Buddha never asked us to believe everything he taught. He asked us to test it, to live it, and see for ourselves. And in the daily act of recollection, of turning toward what is noble and true, we begin to see. We begin to trust. And so faith is not something you wait for. It's something you build, one breath at a time. One quiet moment of remembrance after another. And slowly, you realize the refuge you sought outside was within you all along. In the space ahead, we'll see how this tender, growing faith weathers storms, how it holds steady through heartbreak, loss, and uncertainty, and how, through doubt itself, it can deepen into something even more beautiful. No journey of the heart moves in a straight line. No one walks the path of faith without stumbling. And if anyone tells you they've never doubted, they haven't truly walked at all. Because where there is faith, doubt is never far behind. It's part of the human condition. The mind questions, it resists, it hesitates. We live in a world of impermanence where everything we touch can vanish in a breath. So it's natural, even inevitable, that sometimes we ask, is any of this real? Am I simply clinging to beautiful ideas in a chaotic, indifferent universe? And the Buddha knew this. In the ancient texts, there's a powerful term, vicikika. It means skeptical doubt, one of the 5 hindrances, those inner forces that cloud our vision and weigh down the heart. But here's the thing most people miss. Doubt isn't your enemy, it's your invitation, because faith untested is brittle. It's a glass statue, beautiful but fragile. True faith, the kind that steadies your soul in the darkest nights, is forged in the heat of your questions. Every great practitioner has faced moments of despair, moments where meditation felt empty, where prayers felt unanswered, where the world's suffering seemed so vast, no teaching could make sense of it. Even the Buddha himself, before his awakening under the Bodhi tree, wrestled with fear, doubt, and temptation. It was in meeting those shadows directly, not denying them, that he broke through to wisdom. And so must we. When doubt rises in you, don't turn away. Don't bury it beneath forced positivity or shallow platitudes. Sit with it. Look it in the eye. Ask yourself, what am I truly afraid of here? What do I believe faith is supposed to look like? So often, we mistake faith for the absence of fear, for an unbroken stream of confidence. But in truth, faith is what remains when confidence fails. It's the quiet resilience beneath your panic, the steady pulse beneath your trembling hands. And here's the beautiful paradox. The more honestly you face your doubts, the more unshakable your conviction becomes. Because every time you walk through that storm and refuse to give up, even when no answers come, you are reforging your faith, not as blind belief, but as deep, embodied trust. This is the moment when your spiritual path stops being a theory and becomes lived truth. And here's a secret the ancient teachers whispered to their students. Your doubt is not a flaw. It's a doorway. Each time your mind asks why, it forces you to search deeper. Each time you question the teachings, you're invited to test them against your lived experience. The Buddha never said, "Believe me because I said so." He said, "Come and see for yourself." Faith tested is faith refined. It sheds its need for certainty and transforms into something humbler, wiser. It becomes a faith that can kneel beside grief and not demand answers. A faith that can hold both suffering and beauty without collapsing. A faith that trusts the practice, even when the results are unseen. There's a story of a monk named Mahakassapa, one of the Buddha's closest disciples. After the Buddha passed into final nirvana, Mahakassapa was asked, "What will you do without your teacher, without his guidance?" And the old monk replied, "I will continue to walk this path. Not because the Buddha is watching, but because the Dhamma remains true, whether witnessed or not." That is unshakable conviction. and it is born through countless nights of doubt. So when the storm comes, as it always does, remember this. You are not failing when you doubt. You are growing. Each crack in your certainty lets a little more light in. And slowly, doubt loses its power to frighten you. It becomes another wave in the ocean of your awareness. And like every wave, it too will pass. In those moments, return to your practice, to the breath, to the Anussati recollections, to the simple, wordless acts of kindness, not to force faith back into place, but to remind your heart of what remains steady when everything else falls away. Because the real measure of faith is not how you feel in times of ease. It's how you continue when nothing makes sense. And when you do, when you step forward, one trembling step at a time, something astonishing happens. You realize that faith isn't something you hold. It's something that holds you. And it carries you through the storm. Ahead, we'll explore the ways this cultivated, tested faith begins to ripple outward, changing not just our private inner world, but the way we move through relationships, communities, and life itself. Because faith, when matured, becomes a refuge not only for the one who holds it, but for all who come near. Long before scriptures were carved into palm leaves, before sutras echoed in great halls, and even before the first monastery walls were built, there were stories. Simple words spoken from heart to heart, around village fires, in moonlit forests, by rivers where travelers rested their weary feet. Stories have always been the way human beings made sense of the world. They helped us remember what mattered when the world turned harsh and hope seemed thin. And in the teachings of the Buddha, storytelling isn't a distraction from wisdom. It's the bridge to it. You see, facts inform the mind, but stories move the heart. A teaching explained logically can plant a seed, yes. But a story waters it. It turns ideas into living, breathing truths. It's no coincidence that some of the oldest and most beloved Buddhist texts are stories. The Jataka tales, for example, ancient accounts of the Buddha's past lives. In each story, he appeared as a prince, a rabbit, a wise hermit, or even a tree spirit. And in each, he practiced generosity, patience, or compassion, often at great personal cost. But these weren't just bedtime fables. They were mirrors, invitations for every listener to see themselves within the tale, to realize, I too am capable of this courage. I too carry this potential. This is why storytelling is essential to faith. Because faith isn't built solely on logic or ritual. It thrives on meaning. And meaning is born in the stories we tell ourselves about life, suffering, and the possibility of transcendence. Think about your own journey for a moment. Your darkest hour. The night you sat alone with a burden too heavy for words. What did you reach for? A philosophy textbook? Or a memory? A story of someone, a teacher, a friend, a stranger who endured something impossible and rose above it. That's what kept you breathing. That's what kept your feet moving. And in Buddhism, this principle is sacred. The Buddha was called Shakyamuni, the sage of the Shakya clan. But equally, he was the great storyteller. He used parables, metaphors, and life stories not just to entertain, but to awaken. There's the story of Angulimala, a ruthless murderer who wore a garland of his victims' fingers. Yet when he encountered the Buddha, something shifted, not through argument, not through punishment, but through the simple, unwavering presence of someone who saw his potential for goodness. That story still echoes through the centuries because it teaches a deeper truth. No one is beyond redemption. Even the most shattered heart can turn. And when you hear that, faith stirs. Not blind faith in external powers, but faith in your own capacity to awaken. Storytelling also guards wisdom against becoming dry and lifeless, because knowledge, left on its own, calcifies. It turns into dogma, into rules and clever quotes repeated without understanding. But a story breathes life into wisdom. It takes a lofty idea like impermanence and shows you the old woman who weeps by her husband's grave and the child who laughs in the rain. It shows you your own reflection in their tears and their joy. And suddenly, wisdom isn't something you study. It's something you feel. This is why, when doubt rises, as we spoke of before, stories are where we return, not as escapism, but as medicine, because each story holds a thread of the Dhamma, and every thread leads home. You may find yourself some nights questioning whether your small efforts matter, whether kindness in a cruel world makes any difference. And then you'll remember the story of Venerable Punna, who asked the Buddha, "What if the people in the land where I go are violent and reject me?" The Buddha replied, "Then you can be grateful that they only reject you and do not harm you. And if they do harm you, then you can be grateful they do not kill you. And if they kill you, then you can be grateful to be released from this heavy body and its suffering." That is not a cold, fatalistic teaching. It's a story of supreme inner freedom, of a person so rooted in wisdom and faith that no external force could steal his peace. And when you hear it, a quiet, defiant strength rises in you too. This is the hidden power of storytelling. It builds invisible bridges between faith and wisdom. It allows what is abstract to become personal. It transforms teachings from mere words into living experiences. It reminds us that countless others have walked this path before us, fallen, doubted, risen again. And through their stories, we remember our place in the unbroken chain of seekers. So let the stories live in you. Share them, not to convert others, but to comfort them. Not to boast of wisdom, but to offer a hand in the dark. Because in the end, faith is not a solitary flame. It's a fire built of many small sparks, from the words of sages, the tears of the broken, and the quiet courage of the ordinary. And through story, we pass those sparks along. In a moment, we'll draw this journey together. We'll return to the very heart of why we sought faith in the first place, and what it means to carry it forward. Because what good is faith if it isn't lived? If it doesn't shine quietly through our days, not in grand declarations, but in the way we listen, the way we forgive, the way we rise again. And so we arrive. The final chapter awaits. And so here we are. After traveling through ancient forests of wisdom, walking beside monks and murderers, kings and beggars, listening to the echoes of stories carried through centuries, we find ourselves right back where we began. Not in a temple, not beneath a Bodhi tree, but in the quiet chamber of the human heart. Because that's where faith was always meant to live, not as a borrowed belief passed down unexamined, not as a superstition to shield us from fear, but as a living, breathing force, one that frees rather than binds. You see, the highest purpose of faith in Buddhism is not obedience, it's liberation. The Buddha never asked us to believe blindly. He didn't demand loyalty to his person, but to the possibility within ourselves. The faith he spoke of, Saddha, is the courage to step into the unknown, to test the path for ourselves, to trust that no matter how tangled our lives become, the way back is always here waiting. And you are already on it. Every small moment of kindness you choose, every time you pause instead of reacting, each breath taken in awareness, these are acts of faith, not in some distant heaven, but in the simple, unshakable truth that suffering is not the end. That peace is possible. That awakening is not a story from ancient scrolls, but a birthright waiting inside you. And yes, there will be nights when the path feels dark, when doubt creeps in like fog, when the stories seem like fading echoes. And in those moments, remember this: you were never meant to walk alone. The three jewels, the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha, were not given as distant icons. They are living presences, found in every teacher's wisdom, in every compassionate act, in every community that holds you when you stumble. When your faith falters, lean into them, not as crutches, but as reminders, and let yourself become a spark for others. Because that's the quiet, beautiful secret of this path. The faith that liberates is the faith that's shared. When you embody even a small piece of what you've heard in these words, through your patience, your humor, your humanity, you become part of an unbroken chain stretching back to the Buddha himself. And somewhere, perhaps in a crowded city street, or a lonely kitchen at midnight, or beside a hospital bed, someone will remember your kindness. And in that moment, faith will be reborn again, So this is your invitation, not to believe everything you hear, not to abandon reason, but to be curious, to listen deeply, to question wisely, to trust the pulse of your own heart when it tells you something ancient and beautiful is still alive in this world. And then to live it, in the way you wake, in the way you listen to a friend's grief, in the way you forgive yourself for being human, because faith isn't a badge to wear, it's a light to carry. And in a world aching for kindness, for wisdom, for steady hearts, your light matters. Thank you for walking this path with me, for opening your heart to these stories, these teachings, these quiet truths. May your days be guided by clarity. May your nights be softened by peace. And may you find, again and again, the faith that doesn't bind, but frees until we meet again.